In this video, we're going to be learning about metabolism, which is the study of chemical reactions that organisms do inside of them. If we focus on the chemical reactions that organisms use to produce energy, what we are describing is their trophy or their trophic status within their ecosystem. For example, if we consider bamboo and the giant panda that eats the bamboo, each of these produces the energy in a very different way. Bamboo is a plant, so we know that it is going to absorb energy from all of the sunlight that hits its leaves. Obviously, pandas aren't plants, so they are not able to do this, so instead they gain energy by eating the bamboo and taking the energy that bamboo absorbed from sunlight. What we have just described is the difference between the two major categories of organisms based on their trophy. So bamboo, as well as all other plants, are considered autotrophs or autotrophic organisms. We know any word that contains the prefix auto is doing something by itself. So in the case of autotrophs are producing their own energy rather than consuming it from other organisms. And for this reason, we can also refer to autotrophs such as plants as producer organisms. Now, the giant panda, as well as people, definitely cannot produce our own energy because we can't absorb energy from sunlight directly. We need to get it by consuming other organisms. And again, the other organisms gives us a hint about what the word heterotroph means. So heterotrophs are organisms that need to get their energy by consuming other organisms, and the prefix hetero is a prefix that means different, and this is the hint that heterotrophs need to get their energy by consuming other organisms, and for that reason, we can also refer to heterotrophs as consumers rather than producers. Now that you've been introduced to the two different categories of organisms based on their trophic status, we need to talk about what the word energy means when it comes to organisms. So only autotrophs are able to absorb energy directly from an energy source like sunlight. So instead, we usually need to refer to a specific chemical that is used by most organisms that exist to store energy until they need to use it. And this chemical here is an example of what we call a carbohydrate. These are the chemicals that all living things on Earth use for energy storage. If you aren't familiar with what the word carbohydrate means, you can simply refer to them as sugars, and pretty much every human is familiar with what happens if you eat a bunch of pure sugar. You'll get a small boost of energy before dropping off when that energy is gone. Now, when you do this, the sugar that you are consuming for energy is usually a type of sugar called glucose, which has the chemical formula C6H12O6. This is easily the most common sugar and therefore the most common carbohydrate that exists on Earth. Now, from this, we can further describe more specifically how organisms produce their glucose and what their energy source is to produce glucose. One of these we've already talked about, and that, of course, is plants. So plants are examples of organisms that we call photoautotrophs. We know that plants are definitely autotrophs because they produce their own energy. So in this case, they produce their own glucose. But energy cannot be created, nor can it be destroyed. That energy needs to come from somewhere. And the prefix photo tips us off as to where, because photo is a prefix that means light. So photoautotrophs are autotrophs that get their energy by absorbing sunlight and using that to synthesize or produce glucose, which is why we refer to this process as photosynthesis. photosynthesis. So synthesis is just a word that means to make, and the verb form of this is to synthesize, and we can see that the photo prefix means that it uses sunlight to synthesize glucose. Now, in terms of the chemicals that we need to make glucose, most people understand that plants absorb carbon dioxide and water vapor from the environment and use photosynthesis to turn these into glucose, for which we can write a chemical equation here. So if we take carbon dioxide and water and react them together using the energy from sunlight, we can produce our glucose molecule, C6H12O6, and this reaction is also important for heterotrophs because it supplies them with the oxygen that they need to breathe. Now, what about if you're an organism that lives in an environment where there is no sunlight? This environment here is all the way at the bottom of the deepest parts of the Pacific Ocean where no sunlight is able to reach. But we can see that there's quite a large variety of life that is somehow able to survive without any sunlight. These organisms, specifically types of bacteria that live on the bottom of the ocean, are examples of what we call chemoautotrophs. So unlike photoautotrophs that use sunlight to produce energy, chemoautotrophs use a small family of inorganic chemical reactions. Remember from the chemistry unit that inorganic chemical reactions do not involve carbon. And these organic reactions, using the chemicals found at the bottom of the ocean, are able to produce types of energy that the bacteria can then absorb in order to make sugar. And rather than referring to these reactions as photosynthesis, we can refer to these as chemosynthesis, as in synthesizing glucose using other chemical reactions. And again, this reaction is necessary because sunlight doesn't reach the bottom of our ocean. Now, those are the autotrophs. We're going to split up talking about heterotrophs into two videos because heterotrophs have a lot of different diversity about what organisms can be consumed. So first, we're going to talk about a weird variety of organisms that are called photoheterotrophs. Now, we know that a heterotroph is an organism that consumes other organisms, but a phototroph is an organism that absorbs light. So photoautotrophs, such as specific species of purple bacteria, are organisms that can use sunlight in order to produce energy, but unlike organisms like plants, they cannot do this in a way that makes them self-sufficient. In other words, they are able to absorb energy from sunlight, but they are not able to use this light in order to produce their own sugar molecules. They use this sunlight to drive side reactions, but in terms of a sugar source, they need to consume other organisms' sugar instead in order to get a source of carbon. So photoheterotrophs are a very rare type of organism. You generally don't see this type of trophy outside of a very small number of species of bacteria, many of which are purple rather than the green color that you expect from plants. In part 2 of our discussion of trophy, we're going to look at heterotrophic organisms in more detail because of the very large number of varieties we can have of different heterotrophic organisms.